Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into what might be, well, arguably the single most disruptive intellectual moment in legal history. 5th century BCE Athens.
Oh, absolutely.
This was the era of the Sophists, those radical thinkers who really dared to question the ultimate source of authority.
It was a complete intellectual earthquake. I mean, up until this point, most civilizations just sort of assumed law was handed down by the gods, right? Or
Hmm.
maybe rooted in some immutable, eternal natural order.
Right, unquestioned.
But then the Sophists, people like Protagoras, Thrasymachus, others, they stood up and asked, is law, this thing we call nomos, is it just human convention?
Just something we made up.
Yeah, maybe just a
What?
custom, perhaps a necessary contract for society to function, or
Mm.
maybe even more cynically, just a tool used by the powerful to keep control.
And that is the defining philosophical fault line, isn't it? It still shapes pretty much every legal debate today. This
Yeah.
tension between physis nature or divine truth and nomos, human convention, law,
Yeah.
custom. So, our mission in this deep dive is to trace this really revolutionary idea that law is a construct and see how this tension played out. In the legal and political systems of ancient Athens and then later in Rome, centuries after the Sophists first voiced it.
And the crucial insight, I think, that we gain by doing this is that the philosophical instability they introduced, it never actually went away.
Still with us.
Exactly.
Mm.
By looking at how Athens handled, say, political violence, or how Rome defined something as basic as property, we find that every society, every legal framework is constantly forced to negotiate this ancient dilemma.
Are we obeying the law because it's universally true, because it's physis? Or are we obeying it because it's socially useful, because it's nomos?
That's the core question.
Okay, so let's start with what the Sophists were reacting against. What were they tearing down? Before the Sophists came along, law wasn't really debated in the same way. It was just inherited. Justice felt inextricable from tradition, from ancestry, and crucially, from the will of the gods.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you wanted to see the law in action, you looked at the divine order. That was the source.
So where do we see this most clearly?
Well, to really get the traditional view, you almost have to look at Greek tragedy, specifically Aeschylus's masterpiece, the Oresteia.
Ah,
It's basically a dramatic origin story for the Athenian legal system itself. It shows this huge shift, moving justice from the private family sphere, the oikos, into the public sphere, the polis.
and the divine isn't just sort of hovering in the background.
Not at all. The divine is the foundation. It's an active participant.
And the mechanism for this shift is a trial, right? The trial of Orestes. The source material shows this shared responsibility between gods and humans.
That's right. You had the Furies, these ancient blood vengeance goddesses representing the old way, the endless cycle of retaliation. They're hunting Orestes for killing his mother.
Primal justice.
Exactly. But then you have Apollo, the Olympian god, and eventually the goddess Athena herself stepping in. They advocate for a new system, a state-sanctioned justice.
So it's not just humans deciding. It's way bigger than that.
It's presented as a cosmic realignment, really. The Furies demand that personal, unending blood vengeance. Apollo argues for rational Olympian intervention, and Athena, she establishes the human jury, the Areopagus court, to mediate between these, well, colossal divine forces.
Wow.
This whole complex interaction between chthonic, the earthbound gods like the Furies, and the Olympian gods shows that the legal system needed legitimacy from both realms. It wasn't enough for the state just to say, we decide now.
They had to incorporate the old fears, the old powers.
Precisely. And I think the most fascinating part of that whole story is what happens to the Furies themselves. They start as these terrifying agents of rage, right?
Yeah.
Pure primal justice.
Yeah, they're horrifying.
But they don't just vanish or get defeated in the end. They're literally accommodated, brought into the Athenian state structure.
How so?
They're transformed. They become the revered ones, the Semni.
Hmm.
And they're given a shrine, a place of honor, right underneath the court itself.
Under the court.
Yes. And crucially, they get a new job description. They're now tasked with maintaining order and prosperity within the city, within the polis.
That's brilliant. It's like a legal fiction woven into the very founding myth.
It really is. The state is essentially saying, look, we recognize the terrifying power of blood justice, of ancient curses, but we are now domesticating it. We're channeling it.
So they're not getting rid of divine terror. They're incorporating it, making it serve civic peace.
Exactly. It's the ultimate foundational move to establish the state's authority. The state manages to absorb the deepest, most ancient source of justice, that primal terror of the family curse, and repurpose it as a civic tool.
For early Athenian democracy, legitimacy wasn't just nice to have, it was everything.
It was the absolute foundation.
Yeah.
And if the gods themselves could be persuaded to participate, well, who are mortals to argue against the system?
Now, this idea of grounding societal success, even superiority in divine duty, that wasn't just a Greek thing, was it? When we look over at Rome, we find something similar with the concept of pietas.
Yes, Roman Pietas. It fills a similar role, though perhaps it feels a bit more structured around civic duty compared to the Greek myths.
It wasn't just about being religious in a general sense.
No, Roman Pietas wasn't vague piety at all. It was a really profound, quite concrete sense of duty. Duty towards your family, duty towards the state, and duty towards the gods. Early Roman morality and their sense of success were absolutely defined by adhering to this pietas.
And Roman intellectuals, someone like Cicero, they pointed to this as the reason for Rome's greatness.
Oh, definitely. The Cicero explicitly claimed that the world itself was directed and governed by the will of the gods. And he argued that the Romans surpassed all other nations precisely because they possessed this superior religious sensibility, this stronger commitment to pietas.
So in their view, their military and political dominance was basically proof of divine favor.
That's how they saw it. Proof rooted in their correct moral and religious order. Law, therefore, was just a reflection of this correct order, divinely sanctioned.
But even in Rome, that sophist skepticism, that questioning spirit, eventually started to creep in, didn't it? Threatening to kind of strip the law of its divine halo.
Yes, absolutely. This is where someone like Varro comes in with his critique. He hints that the divine source of law was losing its necessary mystique, its power.
What was Varro worried about specifically?
He seemed concerned about the social and, well, psychological impact of institutionalizing religion too much, making it too ordinary.
How so?
He worried that by introducing physical images of the gods into their cities, statues, temples, the whole apparatus, the Romans were essentially, and this is his phrase, removing fear and adding error. Civitatibus sus et metum dempsisse et errorem additice.
Removing fear. Let's focus on that. Why is that specific fear so essential to the authority of the law in this older view?
Well, think about it. If the ultimate sanction for breaking the law is divine punishment, unpredictable, maybe eternal, definitely terrifying, then the law holds an almost unquestionable force.
Right, it's absolutely.
But once you give the divine a face, a statue you can walk past every day, a temple you can go into, you make the incomprehensible seem manageable, perhaps even vulnerable. You strip away the medium, the dread.
So by making the gods familiar, you accidentally make the law familiar too. And maybe easier to ignore or argue with or circumvent.
That seems to be the implication. The source of law becomes tangible and therefore maybe fragile.
It sounds like Varro is hinting at a deep sociological truth, one the Sophists articulated more philosophically.
Exactly. If the law's ultimate source is seen as corrupted or just made mundane, its special force dissipates. It perfectly mirrors the sophist critique. Once you start questioning the physis of law, its natural eternal truth, you're only left with nomos, with human convention.
And that opens the door to a much more cynical view of what law actually is. Okay, so if law isn't handed down by the gods, then who creates it and why? The sophist Thrasymachus gave maybe the most brutal answer. He famously argued, in Plato's Republic, that justice is simply the interest of the stronger.
It's a harsh view, very unromantic. But, history gives us quite a bit of evidence that seems to support this cynical interpretation.
It's tempting to just dismiss Thrasymachus as a radical outlier, maybe?
You could, but then you look at the reality of Athenian political conflict, and you see his principle reflected right there. The sources talk about the existence of the young party in Athens, particularly during the Peloponnesian War era.
Who were they?
They were a pretty sophisticated, well-organized oligarchical group, secretly active, maneuvering against the democracy, waiting for a chance to overturn it.
And they weren't just plotting in the dark. They had an ideology, a justification for why they should rule.
Absolutely. And it sounds a lot like dressing up the interest of the stronger in, well, noble language. They genuinely believed Athenian democracy was chaotic, prone to mistakes, and basically had to be overthrown.
Replaced by
The rule of the best and most virtuous citizens, which of course meant them. So it wasn't just a naked power grab, or at least he didn't frame it that way. It was about defining a new legal and political structure that ensured they, the elite, remained perpetually in control.
So their rhetoric about virtue and the best citizens is just the mask. The real goal is a legal framework that enforces their own rule, making their interest oligarchy synonymous with justice or the common good.
Pretty much. And this wasn't just happening internally in Athens. Their imperial behavior, how they treated their allies, perfectly illustrated this gap between high-minded legal talk and the raw reality of power.
Ah, yes. You mentioned the Athenian envoy speaking at Sparta just before the Peloponnesian War.
Exactly. That speech is a master class in political spin.
What was the specific claim they were making? Trying to sound reasonable.
They were taking this peculiar credit for offering equal dealing to their subject allies. They even claimed that Athens deliberately put itself at a disadvantage sometimes in legal disputes with allies.
Seriously, they claim they chose to lose in court.
Essentially, yes. They were saying, look how fair we are. We're so moderate, we sometimes let you win, even when maybe we shouldn't have to.
Wow, that sounds like a textbook case of strategic deception. Why even bother with that performance if they held all the power anyway?
Because nomos, even a cynical one, needs a veneer of justice to function smoothly. The Sophists understood this. Power needs justification to be stable.
Right.
The Athenians knew their allies were grumbling, complaining about being oppressed. So, by putting on this public display of judicial moderation, they were trying to preempt a revolt, to manage dissent. They were basically saying, yes, we are the stronger, but look, we've chosen to structure the law in a way that seems beneficial to you, the weaker.
It's all about appearances.
It is. And the sources even note that the envoy admitted Athens was often seen as just loving litigation, even when they supposedly put themselves in a disadvantage. So even their attempts at fairness were viewed with suspicion.
But the underlying reality was still the same, wasn't it? The whole system was built and maintained by Athenian military might. The rule of law was just a tool, a subsidiary function of their imperial interest.
Completely.
Mm.
If Athens decided to overturn a court decision involving an ally tomorrow, what real recourse did the ally have? None.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look across the Mediterranean to Rome, we see even more blatant examples where raw power just utterly eclipsed any notion of universal justice. Thrasymachus would have felt right at home.
Such as?
The Roman acquisition of Sardinia from the Carthaginians.
Yeah.
Early 3rd century BCE. It's chillingly transparent.
Right. Carthage was weakened after the First Punic War with Rome. Rome saw an opening.
Exactly. The Carthaginians were dealing with internal mercenary revolts, total chaos.
Yeah.
Rome just sailed over and seized Sardinia almost without a fight. Later, when Carthaginian envoys came to Rome to, politely ask for it back, maybe discuss reparations.
Did the Romans offer a legal justification?
Not really. They responded with, and the source says, frivolous or at any rate irrelevant complaints about some minor supposed injuries to Roman traders, and then boom, immediately declared war.
Basically forcing Carthage to permanently give up the island under threat.
Precisely. They just manufactured a flimsy grievance and backed it up with overwhelming force.
So much for pietas in that case.
Not a trace. The source material captures it perfectly. The principle that in politics, power is the measure of right appeared in its naked effrontery.
Wow. Naked effrontery.
There was no attempt at legal subtlety, no appeal to divine will or fairness. It was pure Thrasymachian power politics. The legal outcome who owned Sardinia was dictated entirely by who had the bigger army and the political will to use it.
This cynical definition of law, where power rules, seems even more deeply embedded when we look at how Roman law itself explicitly treated people differently based on their social status.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't accidental. It was a deep structural feature of Roman law. There was an explicit established principle that the severity of the penalty depended on the social status of the accused. The Latin phrase is ex causa et persona statuis solet.
So who you were literally determined what justice you received.
In simple terms, yes. The law was actually structured to confirm social hierarchy.
That just flies in the face of our modern ideal of blind justice, doesn't it? How stark were these differences in practice? Can you give an example?
Sure. Consider the crime of inuria. This covered things like personal injury or insult. The law treated different classes completely differently for the same act.
Okay.
A slave who committed inuria, they'd likely just be beaten and returned to their master. That was it.
Okay. What about a free person?
Well, it depended. A free person of lower social status, a humiliores loci, might be subjected to lashing with rods, festivus, public painful punishment.
And the elite, an honestiris.
Well, for them, someone from the upper classes, or ceteri, meaning others of status, the penalty might be much lighter. Perhaps only temporary exile, or maybe an interdiction on holding certain offices or privileges. Nothing physically brutal.
So let me get this straight. A poor citizen and a wealthy senator commit the exact same act of injury or insult. Their punishments aren't just different in degree, they're fundamentally different kinds of state responses.
Absolutely. The law's response was calibrated not primarily to the moral severity of the offense itself, but to the social rank of the person who committed it.
That's incredible.
And what's more, the sources also confirm that an injury committed by someone of lower status, like a slave insulting a citizen, was considered more serious. Why? Because the insult was heightened by the low status of the perpetrator. Crescit enim contumelia ex persona iesque contumelium fecit. The insult grows based on the person doing the insulting.
So the law itself explicitly codified class discrimination. It actively worked to maintain the powerful. Well, because the powerful were the ones designing the system in the first place.
Exactly. It's hard to find a clearer historical example backing up Thrasymachus' famous argument that justice really is just the interest of the stronger.
Okay, that cynical view law as just pure oppression, the interest of the stronger, it's compelling, isn't it? But if law was only that, wouldn't society just be in constant revolt or civil war?
That's a fair point. And the Sophists themselves offered another perspective, maybe a more optimistic view of nomos, law as a necessary social contract.
So not a divine truth, maybe not even inherently just in a moral sense, but a functional tool, something essential for survival.
Precisely. This shifts the focus from Thrasymachus, who emphasizes law as power, towards someone like Protagoras, who saw law more in terms of its utility.
Still conventional, still man-made.
Yes, definitely still nomos, but its primary purpose is seen as pragmatic, to prevent the destruction of the community that would happen if natural human tendencies towards violence and chaos were just left unchecked.
And we can actually see this utilitarian logic embedded in some of the earliest Athenian legal structures, can't we? Going way back to Draco's homicide law.
Oh, absolutely. Draco's law from the 7th century BCE was a really foundational moment for the Athenian state. And what was its main goal?
To stop blood feuds.
Exactly. Its primary concern was the suppression of self-help and violent reprisal, what the Greeks called ekthra. Before Draco, if someone killed your relative, it was basically a family affair. You were expected to seek vengeance, leading to these endless cycles of violence that could tear communities apart.
Like the Furies, but on a human level.
Right. The state was essentially intervening in what had been a private war. It moved jurisdiction for homicide from the family unit to the state.
And the goal wasn't necessarily about enforcing some abstract natural right to life.
Not primarily. It was much more practical. It was about managing inevitable human conflict. The sources describe practices like relatives carrying a spear at the funeral procession of a murder victim that really highlight how prevalent violent reprisal was.
A clear signal of intent.
Yes. Draco's law aimed to suppress that impulse for violent retaliation by saying essentially, stop. The state will handle this now. You don't have to seek personal vengeance and risk destabilizing the whole polis.
So the law becomes a tool for collective self-preservation. It's like a state mechanism designed purely to buy peace from the aggrieved family.
It's a very practical contract with the citizens, isn't it? Give up your personal right to vengeance, and in return, the state will provide a measure of justice and, more importantly, stability.
And this idea that law's main value is its social utility, its ability to prevent chaos. It wasn't just ancient history. Demosthenes, centuries later, used this exact argument.
He did. He explicitly articulated this social utility rationale when he was arguing in court about lesser offenses, things like slander and assault. He basically gave the Sophist justification for why laws against insults were necessary.
How did he frame it? What was his explanation for needing legal actions against just words or minor scuffles?
He argued that laws are established for these things, specifically so that people who feel reviled or assaulted aren't compelled to lash out physically to strike one another, or worse.
To prevent escalation.
Exactly. He urged citizens to wait for the law's remedy. The legal action itself becomes an outlet, a kind of safety valve for human anger and pride.
That really is the essence of nomos as a contract, isn't it? It acknowledges human impulse, the desire to hit back, but provides an artificial, structured mechanism, like a court case, to prevent that impulse from leading to murder or widespread feuding.
Right. The law doesn't magically make people less angry or less prone to violence. It just gives them a procedure to follow instead of reaching for a weapon.
It proves the Sophist's point perfectly, in a way. Law isn't some moral absolute handed down from on high. It's a successful human invention aimed at purely functional social survival.
And without that perceived utility, the convention itself risks collapsing. People might just revert to self-help.
This conventionalist view, that law is made not found, it extends radically even to concepts we tend to think of as almost sacred or somehow natural, like private property.
Yes, that's a huge one. Yet Cicero, who drew heavily on Greek philosophy, including these sophistic ideas, stated it quite plainly.
What did he say?
He was definitive. No property is private by nature. Nihil enim est natura privatum.
Wow. The implication there is massive, isn't it? If property isn't natural, then it's entirely dependent on human agreement, on convention, on enforcement. It's pure nomos.
Completely.
So how did Cicero explain how private property came to be then, if it wasn't natural?
He listed the human mechanisms. Things like long-standing occupancy, like when a group arrives in an empty area and just stays there, or acquisition through victory in war, or, crucially, through law, agreement, contract, or lot.
Look at that list. It's just a catalog of human actions. Settling, fighting, agreeing, legislating, even just drawing lots. Nothing about divine mandate or some innate truth of ownership.
Precisely. So everything that eventually became someone's private property was originally part of something that had been common by nature. The law, then, is the convention, the human agreement, that performs the act of carving up the natural world and assigning ownership labels.
And you can see this playing out in history. Think about the political battles over land ownership in the late Roman Republic, the Gracchi brothers, for instance.
Absolutely. Those incredibly violent conflicts were fundamentally about renegotiating the convention of who owned what land in Italy. The very existence of that kind of bitter conflict confirms that property isn't some fixed natural truth.
It's a legal fiction, ultimately backed by state power and constantly subject to political pressure and change.
Right. And perhaps the most dramatic and certainly the most morally charged illustration of this fundamental conflict between physis, nature, and nomos, convention, centers on human status itself, specifically the ancient debate over slavery.
Ah, yes. This must have been explosive.
It clearly was. The conventionalist argument against slavery was apparently widespread and incredibly threatening in 5th and 4th century BCE Greece. The Sophists were arguing, with pretty compelling logic, that legal slavery was often just an accident of war, or birth purely a matter of nomos, of human law and custom, not nature.
And the sources show that this sophist critique was so powerful, so dangerous to the status quo, that it actually provoked one of the greatest minds in history to formulate a direct counterargument.
Exactly. Aristotle. He was directly provoked into formulating his infamous theory of the natural slave.
Right. The idea that some people are just born to be slaves.
Yes. His theory asserted that some people were slaves by nature, perhaps lacking the full rational capacity needed to govern themselves, and therefore their legal status as slaves was justified by their innate inferiority, by physis.
So Aristotle's theory wasn't just some abstract philosophical observation. It was an active ideological defense against the sophist critique.
That's exactly what it looks like. He was explicitly refuting unnamed critics, almost certainly sophists or thinkers influenced by them, who claimed that slavery was based purely on man-made convention and brute force, nomos and violence.
The fact that Aristotle, who prized logic and systematic classification above almost everything, felt compelled to invent a kind of physiological and psychological justification for legal slavery, that really shows how potent the conventionalist argument must have been.
It does. It shows the immediate, maybe even destructive threat that argument posed. Because if slavery was just nomosis, just custom and force, then the entire economic and social structure of the ancient world, which relied heavily on slave labor, was fundamentally unjust.
And therefore potentially fragile, open to being overturned.
Exactly. It could be challenged, perhaps even dismantled, at any moment if enough people rejected the convention.
That really is the legacy of the Sophists, isn't it? They didn't just ask abstract philosophical questions. Their ideas put the stability of the entire society on trial. So the essential problem never really went away, did it? How do you govern a complex, changing world while trying to maintain the public fiction that your laws are ancient, venerable, maybe even unchanging?
That tension between tradition, the appearance of physis, and practical functionality, the reality of nomos, it just never ceased. And Roman jurists in particular found some really ingenious ways to manage it, often through the use of legal fictions.
Legal fictions? That sounds like an oxymoron.
It kind of is. Legal fictions are fascinating because they are essentially explicit legalized lies. They pretend something is true for legal purposes, even when everyone knows it isn't literally true.
And why use them?
They are maybe the ultimate proof that law is a negotiated convention, a system that often prioritizes pragmatic results and social stability over sticking to absolute literal truth.
So they allow the law to adapt, to change, without ever having to openly admit it's changing, which could be crucial for maintaining public confidence.
Precisely. You preserve the form while changing the substance. How did Roman jurists use these fictions in practice?
Can you give us an example?
Well, a classic one is the fictio civitatis, the fiction of citizenship. Now, Roman civil law, the civic calentius civil, was traditionally supposed to be available only to actual Roman citizens. That was a core principle.
Okay.
But as the Republic and then the empire grew, Rome had massive commercial dealings with non-citizens, with aliens, peregrini, and these people needed access to Roman courts, they needed legal protection for their contracts, and property disputes within Roman territory.
Right, but you couldn't just grant them all citizenship every time they had a lawsuit. That would totally dilute the value and meaning of citizenship.
Exactly. So the jurists used the fiction. In certain types of cases, the court would proceed as if the alien involved were a Roman citizen, just for the purpose of that specific lawsuit.
So they'd pretend he's a citizen to let the case go forward under the established civil law rules.
Yes. The fiction maintained the sacred principle. Civil law is only for citizens, while the functional reality was that the law's scope had been cleverly extended to meet the practical needs of an expanding empire with lots of commerce.
It's like intellectual conservatism being used to shield practical revolution. The fiction masks the fact that they were functionally revising or maybe even replacing earlier, more rigid statute law.
And this served a vital psychological purpose, too. It worked to preserve the legitimacy of all the varied legal sources Rome relied on. By honoring the form of the old law while subtly updating the substance, they prevented a potential crisis of faith in the whole legal system.
It shows a very sophisticated understanding, doesn't it? That nomos, convention, has to manage appearances carefully if it wants to retain its power.
Definitely. And this kind of pragmatic flexibility, this willingness to bend the rules for a greater good, highlights another key point. When the political life of the city, the state itself, was truly at stake, then the survival of that state often became the ultimate law, overriding virtually all other legal principles.
Which brings us back to Athens and some really extreme measures taken after the collapse of that brutal oligarchy, the 30 tyrants.
Yes, we're talking about the amnesty of 403 BCE. This was a moment of absolutely profound political risk for Athens. The city was reeling from a vicious civil war between the oligarchs and the democrats.
And the amnesty wasn't about justice for past wrongs.
Not primarily. It was a direct political tool implemented explicitly for the preservation of the city.
Yeah.
It was designed very deliberately to encourage true reconciliation and stop the cycle of revenge killings.
So it wasn't about finding accountability for what the 30 tyrants and their supporters had done. It was purely about guaranteeing stability for the future.
That was the overriding goal. And it involved a massive political sacrifice. The amnesty explicitly curtailed legal prosecutions. It drastically reduced the number of Athenians who could be held liable for homicide committed during the oligarchy's reign.
That must have been incredibly controversial, letting people who committed terrible acts off the hook.
Hugely controversial. But it was a calculated risk. They essentially traded strict legal justice for political survival. The calculation was, if they allowed all the revenge killings and prosecutions to proceed, the courts would be overwhelmed, resentments would fester, and the newly restored democracy would likely collapse straight back into civil war.
So, nomos to the law of convention, the political agreement demanded that they actually suspend legal justice in order to save the legal framework itself.
That's a great way to put it. And this act of preserving stability, the amnesty agreement itself, was treated as almost the most sacred of laws during that fragile period. The survival of the democracy became the supreme authority, trumping other legal norms.
Is there a specific instance that shows how seriously they took this?
There's a deeply illustrative and frankly quite dramatic anecdote about how they maintained this amnesty. It involves a leading Democrat named Archinus.
Okay, tell us what happened.
According to the sources, an anonymous Democrat, despite the clear terms of the amnesty agreement, tried to bring a prosecution against someone for an offense that should have been covered by the amnesty. In other words, he deliberately tried to violate the contract of reconciliation that was holding the city together.
What did Archinus do?
Archinus, understanding just how fragile the restored democracy was, immediately went to the Council of 500 and persuaded them to summarily execute this offending Democrat without a formal trial.
Wait a minute, a Democrat was executed without due process by the restored democratic government for trying to use the legal system against someone potentially covered by the amnesty. That's astonishing political irony.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
But Archinus apparently argued that publicly making an example of this violation was absolutely essential. He equated maintaining the amnesty itself with the preservation of the democracy.
Why such an extreme measure? He likely needed to reassure everyone, maybe especially their former enemies within the city, and possibly even their Spartan overlords who were watching closely, that the Athenian democracy was deadly serious about maintaining internal stability this time. They wouldn't let things spiral out of control again.
Wow. That really is the ultimate test of nomos, isn't it? The state was willing to commit a technically illegal, certainly highly ironic act, executing one of its own supporters without trial, purely to preserve the convention, the political agreement that was holding the city together.
It seems so. The survival of the political body, the polis itself, superseded all individual rights and established legal procedures in that critical moment.
The law in that instance was revealed for what it sometimes has to be, a mechanism of political triage, capable of requiring profoundly anti-legal actions just to maintain the overall appearance, the possibility of a functioning legal framework. It shows that even in its most desperate hour, Athens understood, perhaps implicitly, what the Sophists had argued explicitly. Their system was a constructed convention, a nomos, that required constant, vigilant, and sometimes even brutal maintenance to survive. Hashtag tag outro.
What a deep dive that was. Right into the very unstable foundations of law itself. It seems like from the moment the Sophists introduced this radical concept of nomos, that law is human, it's constructed, it's not necessarily divine, every subsequent legal system has been forced, one way or another, to justify its own authority.
Yeah, they either have to pretend to embrace some form of physis, some connection to natural or divine truth, or they have to argue explicitly for law's pragmatic utility, its necessity for social order. There's no escaping that fundamental tension they revealed.
We've seen this tension play out in really profound historical moments, haven't we? In the legal theater that domesticated divine wrath back in Aeschylus's Athens.
Or in the cynical, status-based application of power in Rome, where justice clearly meant different things for different people.
And even in the necessity of declaring legal fictions. Those polite lies, or sometimes suspending justice entirely, like with the Athenian amnesty, all for the sake of political survival. The Sophists really did rip open the question, and it feels like it has never fully closed.
It hasn't. Which leads us, I think, to a truly provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry forward from all this.
Okay.
If law is merely convention, if it's constantly subject to being twisted into the interest of the stronger, as Thrasymachus so bluntly argued.
Or perhaps more generously, if it's just the necessary, maybe even ugly compromise we make for social survival, as Protagoras might suggest.
Right. If either of those is true, or even partly true, what then is the moral basis for fighting to preserve or to change the laws we currently live under? Where does that ought come from if law is just is?
That's a tough one. We have to ask ourselves, don't we, if we as modern citizens are still sometimes struggling under laws that are, at their core, merely the interest of the stronger, just maybe dressed up in more sophisticated language about eternal justice or economic necessity.
The Sophists gave us the critical tools to dismantle those claims of perpetual legal truth, to look behind the curtain. Your task now, maybe, is to decide what principles, if not divine nature or immutable physis, you will use to try and build or defend a law that you believe is genuinely worth fighting for.
A question for your own continuous deep dive, perhaps. Thank you for exploring this fascinating and frankly quite unsettling legal landscape with us.